Hi. So good day, good afternoon, everyone, and I hope you're having a good uh, training day. I have the pleasure today of laying down the basics as to why we are talking about e-mobility, and touching upon the wider drivers, the trends, and the basic rationale for e-mobility and why it is important for us to have these as a piece towards moving towards a more sustainable pathways for the mobility sector in the region. I'll go quickly through the slides because a lot of the things that I'm going to say have been mentioned in the presentations earlier by our colleagues. But essentially, I would like to start the discussions with the discussions on urbanization, as the project itself is focusing on filling the gaps in terms of the urban mobility challenges. And we are seeing the overarching trends in urbanization. Currently, we are estimated to have 55% of the global population living in urban areas, a proportion that is expected to increase to around 68% by 2050. Asia, despite its relatively lower levels of urbanization, is home to 54% of the urban population globally. Together, India, China, together with Nigeria, will account for more than 35% of the projected growth of the world's urban population leading up to 2050. By 2030, the world is projected to have more than 43 megacities with more than 10,000 inhabitants. Most of them would be in developing regions. However, some of the fastest growing urban agglomerations are cities with fewer than 1 million inhabitants. So it's also important to look into the medium-sized, rapidly emerging cities in our regions, particularly in Asia and as well as in Africa. And urbanization is very much critical in the discussions of the wider developmental goals that we would touch upon later on. We also note the rapid economic growth that is happening, particularly in the developing regions, also in sub-regions in Asia. The map here depicts the projected GDP growth rates by 2026 by the IMF. Again, very similar to the message in the previous map. We see that the gravity of the growth in Asia, as well as in the African regions, as we move forward into the future. Urbanization, population growth, economic growth are some of the overarching priority drivers that lead us towards discussing challenges and opportunities towards mobility transition, particularly taking into consideration e-mobility. And why is this important? So essentially, economic growth, urbanization naturally leads to increased demand for transportation. So we focus our discussions on urban transportation for now, but in both cases, we see the importance of instituting appropriate measures, particularly in the region. The graphs here are based on the figures from the 2021 Transportation Outlook by the ITF. I won't go too much into the details, but you'll see here the projected growth in terms of transportation activity for both the urban freight and passenger transport in the horizontal axis and the corresponding CO2 emissions. We'll see some more slides later on this, but essentially in both cases, it's glaring how rapidly the Asian region would contribute in terms of overall transport demand, urban transport demand, and CO2 emissions. And in relation to these, naturally, the demand for transportation activity would beg to be met, and the inability of existing transportation systems, take for example, urban public transport systems to accommodate the demand, coupled with increasing purchasing power as enabled by economic growth in the region, driving motorization rates. The graphs here you see would just depict the estimated car and commercial sales data in the region from the OICA, which essentially represents vehicle manufacturers. Of course, in the region, there is also the high utilization of small 2- and 3-wheeler vehicles, which are not reflected here. something that we'd also be discussed in the coming days, especially tomorrow, I think. I don't know, someone's, okay. We recognize also the different pathways that the different countries are moving in. Some of them are having very high growth rates in terms of four-wheeled vehicles. Some of them are gearing towards the smaller two and three-wheelers due to a variety of reasons we just need to take into consideration. So in relation to that, increasing activity in motorization would naturally lead to increasing energy consumption. We note that it is estimated that more than 90% of transportation energy are derived from petroleum-based products. The APEC, for example, the Energy Working Group estimates that the 21 economies under the group would be increasing energy demand in the transportation sector by 21% the next 3 decades. And fossil fuels are projected to continue to make up more than 60% of the energy mix in the region, and would also account for nearly 2/3 of the global demand. The increased consumption is highly interlinked with other critical challenges in economies that also have high dependencies in terms of imported oil, as well as those countries which have significant resources going to, say, oil subsidies. Mitigating climate change and the adverse impacts is one of the key global challenges for us today and the coming generations. Transportation itself contributes a fourth of the energy-related CO2 emissions, and in many countries, road transportation comprises up to 90% of transport-related emissions. So early actions by governments, industries, and users to identify opportunities to improve energy efficiency, reduce demand, and move towards lower carbon intensity energy in the transportation sector are indeed vital in terms of achieving lower emission pathways and to enhance mitigation, climate change mitigation in the transport sector. I won't go into details, but we know that aside from the greenhouse gases, the cities in the region are also pestered with local urban air pollution, and in many cities, transportation would play a key role in terms of contributing to the different local air pollutants. On the right, you'll see the estimates of the International Council on Clean Transportation in terms of the transportation attributable deaths due to air pollutant emissions, where again, Asian subregions are glaringly highlighted. More than the, let's say, the wider challenges that we are faced with, we also need to consider at the local level the need to provide adequate, high-quality mobility services in the cities, the provision of safe, accessible, affordable, inclusive, sustainable mobility services directly define the livability of cities and the lives of the citizenry. These multi-dimensional, multi-level goals have been highlighted in different processes, the global, regional, national, and local levels as well. I will not go through them in detail, but essentially, if we consider, for example, the Agenda 2030 as embodied by the Sustainable Development Goals, we see the importance of transportation mobility that cuts across the different SDGs. Essentially because it's essentially the backbone of the economy in functional societies. It directly relates to SDG 3, ensuring healthy lives and promotion of well-being. 7, ensuring access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, modern energy for all. SDG 9, building resilient and inclusive infrastructure. 11, making cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, sustainable. And 12, ensuring sustainable consumption and production patterns. We also indirectly relate many of the global goals, no? And these are translated in different capacities at the urban level, in the new urban agenda, and also relates to the other global and regional processes, as you would see here. And talking about e-mobility, considering the different drivers, the different trends and challenges, we look towards a solution. But I would also like to propose a mindset that might not seem too obvious at first glance, but we would need to think e-mobility is not just about the electric vehicles. You see it as being based on technological innovations, but it's really an enabler for the transformation. It's not just about the electric cars, something that I would imagine would be, at the forefront of many marketing communication strategies and messages. But yeah, we consider the different applications at the urban level, but we see that e-mobility should not also be treated in isolation, and that we should actually be thought of as a puzzle piece that needs to be integrated with other solutions, as we've seen in the earlier presentations. We should see it within a wider socio-technical system, which recognizes the role of technologies, markets, policies, regulations, processes, cultures, and how they interact with one another. And other wider opportunities, such as the strengthening of the digital transformation and integration of ICT into mobility, can lead to wider chances for transformation. If we focus on strengthening, for example, public transportation systems through e-mobility innovations, coupled with digitalization mechanisms that enables resource sharing, of vehicles, of trips, of assets, spaces, parking, etc., we can encourage wider system transformation and not limit ourselves to changing the propulsion systems. I think this is what the Solutions Plus is all about, and what we're trying to do in terms of investigating these different innovations and how they relate to one another in the living labs that we are working on. We circle back to the provision of more sustainable mobility. We see the potential impacts of mobility in terms of, number one, avoiding unnecessary motorized travel. If we capitalize on, say, sharing systems or shared electric vehicles towards integrating them into wider systems, reducing the need for ownership, reducing the need for spaces for parking, which can later on enable further densification of cities, as we've seen shifting mechanisms towards through enabling the better integration of e-mobility services into public transportation networks, and improving fleets directly from the very rudimentary levels in terms of retrofitting and to gradual procurement, as also mentioned, I think by Kathmandu earlier, by Bhushan, in terms of having these targets towards a wider systematic change. I won't go again into detail, but we know e-mobility can lead to direct benefits in terms of energy environment, in terms of urban pollution. We eliminate directly tailpipe emissions, but we also need to consider the importance of transforming the electricity sector in general as well, to avoid just shifting the emissions from one tailpipe to another, another pipe. E-vehicles pound for pound can also be more energy efficient as compared to the counterparts due to the inherent characteristics of the vehicle, lighter vehicles, lesser moving parts, etc. And again, we propose that we don't just look at e-mobility merely as changing motors or propulsion systems, but we think of it as more of looking at the different forms and solutions that are appropriate at the in terms of fitting in to the wider systems. There are also a multitude of economic and societal benefits depending on the situation of the city or the country. But e-mobility can help, alleviate oil dependence, which can also be, a national security related matter. More importantly, it can spur new business and industrial opportunities across the different chains of the ecosystem, related to the EVs itself, the charging facilities, the services that are generated through the creation of the interlinkages between these different components. The evaluated benefits could definitely be significant. And yeah, we know that there are going to be trade-offs as we recognize the challenges of trying to bring balance in terms of meeting the different goals of the different stakeholders. And I think this is something that would be discussed by my colleague Sunny in the next presentation. But I would also just like to inform everyone that within the solutions project that we are working on a set of key performance indicators that would aid the assessment and evaluation of e-mobility scaled up concepts, which we think are embodying the most relevant priority goals that come along with e-mobility initiatives, something that we would be sharing later on with the wider community. Let me just end this presentation in terms of circling back to the mindset of an e-mobility as a system. We've seen the different challenges that we are working with. And we've discussed how e-mobility in the widest sense can bring and can be aligned with different economic, environmental, societal goals. But I would also, again, like highlight the importance of thinking about e-mobility from the perspective of a socio-technical system, with the importance of avoiding the notion that e-mobility equates just to the e-vehicles. The interactions between the stakeholders in the ecosystem, again, would be highlighted, discussed by my colleague Sunny in the next presentation. And I think with that, I would like to thank you very much for your patience and for attending the training today. Thank you very much.